All right, well, I think we're going to make a start on the webinar now. So, hi, I'm Charlotte Hearn, and we've got our webinar today on choosing the right software in market research. I've got Phil Hearn here with me, who's going to take you through a presentation, and at the end, myself and Phil will do some questions. There's a small Q&A box in the bottom where you can type in anything you'd like to ask. So what I'll do now is I'll pass over to Phil, and he will start taking you through the presentation.
Hi, thank you for that introduction, Charlotte, and welcome to this webinar today. I'm going to start by saying that I'm first of all delighted that we've got such a big audience joining for this webinar today. I did worry that when we set up this webinar that it's a little bit different from our other webinars in the sense that we're not selling to you today. In fact, in the whole of this webinar, I'm going to try not to mention any of our products. If I do, it'll be a mistake or maybe just a very subtle reference. But certainly the aim of this webinar is to help you to choose the right software, perhaps not just in market research, perhaps outside market research as well. But I'm going to be looking at market research topics today within this whole business of choosing the right software for yourselves. And perhaps you're right, I'm going to address this first to be a bit skeptical, because here's someone talking who owns a software company who probably wants to sell you some software, and here he is helping you choose the right software. So it'll be quite right of you to say, well, perhaps all he's trying to do is guide us to our software. But actually, that's not quite true. I think, as I've been longer and longer in this business, I've actually found that guiding the right people to our software is actually very important, and actually keeping the wrong people away from our software is also important to our business, because first of all, we want the right customers, and secondly, there's no real benefit in spending time with people who really don't actually want the software you've got to offer. So whilst I accept your skepticism, if you are skeptical, that is, I really hope that I can give you some real help in choosing the right software for your particular needs in market research, in the sense that I can give you lots of pointers to things that might guide you to making the right choices about the software you use. And I'm quite respectful of the fact that it might not be our solutions that are the right ones every time. There may be other products that suit your particular needs better. What I am keen to do is to make sure that if we do fulfill your needs very well, I'd like you to buy from us. And so that's perhaps the extent of my selling that I'm going to get out of the way in this webinar today. And just like other software vendors, I've seen over the many years that I've worked in this industry, I've seen the right buyers come to us. I've also seen the wrong buyers come to us, and sometimes the right buyers have not bought our software, and I find that particularly disappointing. But equally, I've found the wrong buyers come to us sometimes, and sometimes they've actually bought our software. Although I think as time's gone on, our marketing has actually push people who are the right types of buyers to us, so I hope it has, and actually steered the wrong buyers away, because I think having the right customers is really important, and it's something I advocate for any other companies out there, that you seek the right types of clients that suit your business, rather than just trying to shoehorn everybody in and trying to get every customer that might be passing by. And I'm going to justify that a little bit. I don't know how many people here read a blog that we have on our website. There's roughly 2 to 4 articles posted each month. Some are informative, some actually are very objective or tend to be objective comments about the market research industry, mainly from a software point of view. But some are selling perhaps, but not many of them are selling. Most of them are trying to teach things and provide information. And indeed, as a software company, we see that as an important role to offer, that we should be teachers, we should be giving information, because even some of the quite established market research agencies out there and people who do market research aren't necessarily informed about software. And I think one of the roles that we like to perform is to provide information, act as teachers, give advice, and work with you to help you do what's best for your company. So I would advise you to read our blog. There's a lot of very good articles on there which I feel are very objective. I'm happy to be challenged on those. If you don't agree with them, we post a lot on LinkedIn, and so I'd recommend that you follow both myself and the company on MRDC on LinkedIn, MRDC Software on LinkedIn. But we're happy to be challenged on those. If you don't think they're objective or you have a different viewpoint, I really like to hear those. And in a sense, perhaps that's the whole idea of this webinar today. It is perhaps to teach, to offer ideas, to listen to what ideas you have, and to start a dialogue. And I really do like to ask the question why. I think a lot of companies, when they're selling software, sort of tell you what it's doing, but don't actually necessarily say why their software might work for you or in a particular situation. And I think the why is a very important part of business that is often overlooked. We're often too keen to say what we do and say we're the best at doing this type of research, that type of research, whatever it might be, but actually not saying why. And so I think that's an important part of what we like to preach and offer. And I could go on about our software products at great length, and probably like the products that you sell or the services that you sell, you think they're the best and you think they're really good. And I'm the same. I think our software products are really good. But I'm not going to talk about that today, because what I do think is that whilst I think our products are very good, I don't think they're always the right tool for everybody. Some software companies do like to go out there and say that their products suit everybody. I just don't believe that. And I think we have good fits for certain customers, and we want to be the software supplier to where we're a good fit. So there's the end of my sales talk perhaps for today. And hopefully this webinar will guide you through some of the things. So that's enough of the introduction. What this webinar is going to focus on is what I believe are 14 key decision drivers that you should be making when you buy any software, but particularly today we're going to be talking about software in market research. And not all of the 14 may apply to you, but I think probably more than most people consider of these drivers. I think most people consider less than they should do, and maybe not all 14 should be considered. Maybe only 10 or 11 apply to you. So I see this as a way perhaps of opening up ideas and perhaps a discussion on what is important. And indeed, if there's 15, I'd like to learn what that 15th one is and add it to this list, which I shall be putting out into a white paper in the near future on our website. So I want to get one thing out of the way, two things out of the way before I go too far. And one of the things that we obviously talk about, or people come to software companies like us, is because of recommendation, or that they want to deal with the market leaders. And I want to get those two things out of the way first of all, because I think particularly with specialist software like software for market research, I actually think sometimes they can cause more confusion and be less helpful than some of the other things that we're going to cover. Recommendation is fine and works, I think, in certain fields, particularly where you want something that performs just a function. So if you want something that handles your expenses or something like that in a tidy way, or acts as a diary, if somebody recommends something to you and it's got the key one or two or three features that you need, that's fine. Market research software tends to go a bit beyond that. It tends to perhaps have one function, like perhaps collect online data, but then it goes a bit beyond that, because it doesn't often end there. Although if your business is just collecting online data and giving it to someone else, it might end there. But many people then want to process that data into reports and so on. So it doesn't just end there, or want to move that data into some other software, which we'll come to later. So I think recommendation can work where someone's doing the same thing as you. but recommendation can actually let people down, where you perhaps meet somebody at a conference, they tell you the software's great, but actually what you're doing is either completely different or at least quite subtly different from what they're doing, and then recommendation isn't right. And indeed, I would go as far as to say, in fact, one of our big customers recommended one of our software products to another company. They met them, I think it was a conference or something similar at some event, and when we come to talk to them, we realised we weren't the right software supplier for what they thought they wanted. They thought they wanted to just come to us, check us out, get the price, and buy it. They actually weren't the right. We weren't the right supplier for them because we didn't supply what they wanted. And I think that can be true of others. And I'm also going to deal with market leaders here, as I said. Market leaders are normally market leaders for a reason, and that reason could be that they got the best software package. It could have the most things in it. It could handle the biggest projects. It could have the lowest price, so it could just be price. And indeed, there is quite a bit of free software around in market research now. It could be the best fit, but it might not be. So market leaders, I think, yes, they're market leaders for a reason usually, and it might be because they're the best, it might be because they're the worst, but they're the cheapest. I think really that doesn't really come into the what I call the 14 key decision drivers. Market leaders could be the right product for you, but they might not be. So I think there's some digging beyond that to look at what really works for you. So I'm going to first of all deal with some of the things that I think most people do cover when they look at buying a piece of software. And I want to add a few things to that. And functionality, of course, is the first thing that most people consider, particularly if it's the users of the software that are approaching a software company, either ourselves or another one. And it's quite common that you'll want to check that it does the things that you do. It can handle maybe the size of surveys that you want it to handle, the complexity of surveys you want it to handle, the detailed types of analysis you want, has the statistical functions that you need, and so on. And I'm speaking very generally here, and I don't want to get into specifics or talk about too much about detail here. I want to talk about principles, and functionality is a high level one. Some companies print or put on their website or have printouts or downloadable lists, well, are checklists. I think they're quite good. They have their place. I personally find them a bit overwhelming when I get a checklist of 200 things, because once you've got a list of 200 things, it no longer becomes a checklist. It becomes an overwhelming amount of data, which, if you read through, is likely to blur your thinking. It's impossible to absorb 200 things. I was looking at an online website, online survey suppliers website, where it's a low cost, and they had a checklist, and I think it ran to about 200 things. I won't mention their name. But I found it overwhelming, and it was easy to think, okay, I've got 200 things here, so therefore it must do everything. Probably, and in fact it didn't, because when I looked a bit deeper, I managed to find quite a lot of holes in things it didn't cover, and it might have suited some people, that software, and I'm not particularly criticising this software, but at the end of it, it was masking the fact that it actually didn't have a lot of functionality. It was actually just giving you a huge overwhelming list to give the impression that functionality was there. One thing I think works very well is that you produce a checklist of your own. Something I encourage customers that come to us to do is to produce a spreadsheet, and in it put down all the things that they think they ought to have in the software, so that we can go through it. We can then say yes and no if they're answers or questions or checks that have a yes/no answer, or we can quantify that. So somebody might say to us, what's the maximum number of tables I can run in your software? I said I wouldn't mention a software product today. I've managed just about to do it there. And I can then put an answer to that, which might be, 20, 500, 5 million, unlimited, whatever it might be, and I can answer those questions. And I think that works very well as a software buyer or potential buyer, having a checklist and getting answers from us, because then the most pertinent things to you are being answered. The next thing that I'm going to cover, and it's something that I think pretty much every buyer of software wants to know, is the price. There's not many customers that come to us and say we're going to have that software regardless of what it costs. It would be nice for us, I'm sure, if that was the case. But price is something that seems easy to deal with, in the sense that you ask for a price, you get an answer. The thing that I find more difficult is value, and price and value are two different things. And I really would encourage you, and that's really quite a lot of what I'm going to say here, is to assess the value of the software you're buying or might be buying to you. And I think that's something that really is, dare I say, undervalued or not considered enough, in that people look at the price tag but don't necessarily look at what value they're getting for that. I know somebody in our business who worked in it for years who gave a very good example of this, where they talked about people doing survey analysis and talked about the fact that if there was a price tag, let's say of $500, that software might be given to a team of people, but there might be an add-on for $100 that would make the team far more productive, perhaps 25% more productive. Many people might not buy that add-on because it meant spending another $100. So price and value are very different things and need to be assessed in terms of what productivity that will give you. I've seen people buy online software, for example, where it's cheap and does what they want in terms of functionality, collects the data, but then when they got the data, there's somebody in data processing who spends enormous numbers of hours reformatting that data so that it can be analysed. And so the cost of the software is cheap, but the cost of reformatting that data over the course of a year, perhaps handling, let's say, 30, 40, 50 projects, might be something like 500 hours. And that 500 hours could be quite expensive and prone to error. So cost, I think, is something that is important, that I think all buyers consider, or most buyers consider quite seriously, but I think value is actually quite important. The next thing I want you to consider, and most people I think consider, is look and feel. And I have some thoughts about this as well. I think software should be, you should feel comfortable with it. It should look pretty good. It should feel comfortable to work with. But I would also ask you to, not get confused with appearance. I've seen some software, and there's a product in my mind now, I'm not going to mention it, that looks absolutely really nicely designed. It looks perfect when you open it. Actually, when you come to use it, finding the options you want is actually very difficult. It's overly structured. So when you want a particular option, you're always going down paths or trees to find that option. So it looks quite appealing and looks quite tidy, but actually when you come to use it, it's very labor intensive. So look and feel is important. It has got to be nice to work with. It mustn't just look nice. And I think also that another consideration here is, who are the people using the software? If they're frequent users and they're going to find where the bits and pieces they want within the software are easily, or there can be shortcuts to those key features that they want, it doesn't matter, because they'll find them, they'll know where they are. If the user base that's going to use the software you're buying are people who are going to use it maybe once every, 3 months, 2 months, that's going to be quite annoying, because they're not going to be able to find those features. It'll be slow to find them and might end up taking a lot more of their time than you would expect. So look and feel is something that people consider. I think it's important, but you have to put that alongside the frequency of use and how easy it is really to use. I think, ease of use sometimes is more important than appearance. And as they say, appearances can deceive. So that's another thing that I want to add there. Now, I'm going to go on to now some of the things that perhaps aren't always considered. Perhaps those three I think are usually considered, although perhaps I would like to think I've added a little bit to that. I'm going to come on to the next thing, which is data compatibility. And this is something that I really think is often very underestimated. Software can look as though it does everything you want. So I'm perhaps thinking of an online software tool. It might do everything you want in terms of getting your questionnaire fully featured, make it nice for people to complete the surveys, manage the surveys very well, very easy to launch your surveys. Then what? Getting the data out. I know of teams of people in data processing who spend hours working on the data to get it reformatted or in some form that can be used in the software they've chosen for their data analysis, their tables, or perhaps their back-end reporting and client delivery. So data compatibility is important. I think it's quite important that the software that you buy is compatible with things like SSS, which is an interchange format which you can look at on www.triple-s.org, and that's a data sort of center or style that is shared by I think about 50 software vendors around the world. That means that you can easily move your data from one piece of software to another, so that you can perhaps provide it to a client in some other form, or just read it back in to something else that you want to use that does another part of your data processing or your survey analysis processing. Another format that I think is not a format, but it's actually another product that's used. Many people want data in SPSS format. SPSS may or may not be the best software to use. It's not one of my personal favorites, but it is something that many people use around the world, and many people have built bridges to and from SPSS. And so using software that's compatible with SPSS, I think, is also quite important. So considering data conversions, data compatibility, exports, if your client wants data in a database to go perhaps into some online system that they have, so perhaps if your client is a bank, they may want the data available in some software in a form that can go straight into a database so that they can use it within their internal reporting systems, for example, because banks will already have their internal reporting systems, and they'll know nothing about SSS. They may know about SPSS, but that's unlikely. But they may want some SQL Server database, for example. And so how easy it is to get data into that might be important, or it might not be. So moving data is important. I'd also ask you to look at here, particularly for data collection, whether multi-mode is possible. If you think you want to do a survey that's perhaps mainly online, but you want some paper questionnaires for those respondents that are not online, you need to look and see whether data is really compatible when it comes in. I know there are vendors of software out there that say they're multi-mode, but actually what it means is they can collect multi-mode, and then they have to combine the data together in some sort of recoding process. And so it might look as though it's multi-mode, but actually when it gets pulled together, it actually is two sets of data that need to be merged. And so I call that fairly non-compatible, or that could be very non-compatible data. The next thing I want to consider as key factors is scripting versus GUI, which stands for graphical user interface, or menu-driven software, as some people call it. They're very different worlds. Scripting and GUI are just completely different worlds. Scripting needs experts to use it. It needs people who are going to use it regularly, if not day in, day out, but regularly, because learning and using any language takes repetitive use to get good at, and to learn the tricks and the shortcuts. it's no good using a scripting language once a year, because by the time you come to use it again, or users come to use it again, they're going to have forgotten most of the things that they've learned. I've written quite a lot of blog articles on this, and you may want to search our blog to look at some of the differences between scripting and GUI, perhaps in a bit more detail than I'm going to cover here. So scripting's great if you've got the right team. If you haven't, I would really advise against scripting. Get a piece of software, if you can, that has a user interface that's friendly. Graphical user interfaces tend to mean that people make less errors, so that's a positive. It probably means they take a bit more time to do it, because what you can do in a language is often make shortcuts, although not always. Some languages are very poor, but most languages generally that are used in market research are pretty good. But it really depends on the volume of work you have and the type of people who are going to be using the software. And I'd actually highlight another couple of points on this, in that there are some software packages out there, and I'm not going to mention names again, that give the impression that you do everything through a user interface and it's easy to use. It's when you find that you need 5 days training to use that software that actually that should be a warning signal to you that probably it's not really a graphical user interface, that just does some of the basics and no more, that actually you have to use a scripting language to get anything from the software. So there are some software packages out there that present themselves as though they have a nice, friendly, easy way of doing things, but actually to get anything out of them, you learn scripting. And often the clue to that is if you need to go on a 5-day training course to use it, or maybe even a 2 or 3 day training course. And we've come across quite a lot of companies lately who look at splitting their scripting and non-scripting work. So scripting normally means you get more power, you can do more difficult things and do things more quickly. But we are aware of companies who, for example, do their difficult online surveys in a product maybe like Confirm It or something like that, but they do their perhaps 90% of their simpler work in something like Snap, or perhaps one of the free software packages that are out there, because it doesn't need to be scripted. It doesn't need that level of sophistication that the high-end packages take. The next thing that I'm going to ask you to consider is your needs, and this is something that I think again is not considered. It's very easy when you're evaluating software to give it a test project, and that's a common way of trialing a piece of software, to give it a test project. That I find can and cannot work in many cases. A test project, I've seen people try to process or handle the most complex project they've ever handled when they're trialing a software. That's usually a disaster, because they're struggling to learn and use the software, and they'll come out negatively quite often because they're not going to handle it in the right way. And I've also seen people try the simplest project they've ever handled, and of course then any project can probably be handled that way. It can be handled in that software, so it's not very a fair test. So I don't really believe that if it's trialing that giving it the simplest or the hardest project works. Somewhere in the middle probably is better. That's quite a vague statement I've made there, I realise that, and it's quite subjective what's in the middle. But perhaps a better consideration is examining yourself what your needs are. Are they fixed or are they uncertain? Do you have projects that some of which, or a percentage of which, are very simple and a percentage of which are very complex? Do you know what your needs are for the next year? If you're an agent, a data processing bureau, you probably don't know, or you're a data collection house, you probably don't know what level of complexity you can expect over the next year. You might get some simple projects and some complex. If you work in one field where your questionnaires are fairly prescriptive or similar, you probably do know, and so your testing can be carried out, or your evaluation can be carried out in a different way, and you can probably check just one project would be processed okay, and you can be fairly confident it will work. Whereas if you're uncertain of what you want, you might want to buy something that's got a bit more power, rather like buying a car with a bigger engine in case you want to go faster, for example, so that you can handle those needs. But I always believe in talking to the software vendors, and asking them, about both what your bulk of your work is and what your most complex projects are, because then you can gauge whether that software can handle it, and be the right tool for you. So considering whether your needs are fixed or uncertain, I think is quite an important consideration in the whole process, and I think that's just one thing that I'd like people to consider. Let's move on to the next thing, and that's an upgrade path. And many software packages offer upgrade paths in the sense that you can buy add-ons or you can buy the next level up, which offers more. Is there an upgrade path? Is there something that once you've conquered what you're doing in the software, you can do more than that? Now, going back to the previous point there, if your path is fixed or you have fixed needs, you won't need an upgrade path, or as far as you can see, you won't need an upgrade path. But if you think you might want to do something more complex, we have customers who come to us, I said I wasn't going to sell, who start with one of our easier products, but they then upgrade to a more sophisticated package so that they can do more complex work or or projects more efficiently if they've got the volume, perhaps something like that. It's important in that case to consider that you might need different staff, though, because often more complex software needs more skilled staff, or certainly some money and time spent training and re-educating. So considering the upgrade path, if it's appropriate, I think is something that you need to look at. And if it hasn't got an upgrade path and you think you might outgrow it, you really ought to consider how easy it is going to be for you to move. I don't think people always think about what the risk is of investing in a software product. They think, okay, how easy is it to use this product? How much will it cost? What's its functionality? But if there's a risk you're going to go outgrow that product, are you trapped? Is it going to be costly or difficult to move from that product to something that is a bit more powerful and perhaps more expensive? And I think that's something that you should think about when you're purchasing software. The next thing I want you to consider is the frequency of use. I have mentioned this, and so there's a little bit of overlap here with previous points that I made. But frequency of use, I think, is something that's quite important. It ties in, certainly with scripting and GUI, that if you're using something irregularly, really a graphical user interface is probably what you want. But picking something up and down, I know I've worked with some software where I find it difficult to get back into it. One of my sidelines outside of business is that I've designed some websites for a couple of people. I'm strictly an amateur, by the way, but I've done that for some organizations that I belong to, and I find using web development tools, I find them very, very easy when I'm using them regularly, but when I don't use them for a year and come back to them to update the website, I find it quite difficult. And so frequency of use is really important, and that can be what I call clunky software versus easy to use software. So I think that's something to think about. How often are you going to use it, or how often is each user going to use it? If it's a piece of software, perhaps that 60 different people, but they're only going to use it each once or twice a year, perhaps for a piece of software that helps you produce charts or reports, it might not be something that they use very often. It's got to be very intuitive. Otherwise, perhaps either you've got to use the tool in a centralized sort of way, or it's not going to be the right tool for somebody who's going to try and perhaps produce a report from data if that software is difficult to use. All right, let's go on to the next point I want to talk about, and this revolves around human support, and including this, although it's not restricted to this, is the onboarding process. One of the things that I think you really should ask, and something we like to work with the clients on before they purchase, is what the onboarding process is. Some have no onboarding process. Some you just buy the software and you're on your own. That's probably the worst case. Others will have various procedures that they'll want to put you through to make sure you get the best from the software, with perhaps follow-ups to follow. Others may want to discuss it with you to discuss what's most appropriate, and that will obviously it'll obviously vary from product to product. But onboarding is a really important part of it. It really doesn't do a lot of internal good if you buy a piece of software and the staff that it's bought for, the software, struggle to use it. They'll if they start unfavorably with a piece of software, they'll probably stay unfavorable with it. And so it's important to check what the onboarding process is when you're buying software. And that can be, as I say, anything from good to bad, responsive to not responsive. But the human support is really important as well. So, what sort of support do people offer? Is it something that you'll get within an hour? Is it 24 hours? Is it no support? Is it an email address that you have to wait for a reply? Is it a queuing system? All sorts of things like that I think are important considerations, because typically you're going to need help. And depending on the product, that might be a lot of help at the beginning and not much help later on. Or it might be help that you want to get to learn to use it at the beginning, some more help to get really efficient at using the software. I'm thinking of perhaps more complex products here, but then perhaps help that you want 1 or 2 years down the road to handle perhaps cumbersome projects, or projects where there might be a better way of doing it, but you don't quite know how to do it yourself. So all those things are really important in the process. Support materials are also important. How well is it documented? Is it a manual? Is it online, the help? Is there any help at all that's available? Are there tutorials? Are there videos? Are there videos that get you started? Are there videos to show you how to deal with particular topics? And are there example projects? Perhaps that's something that's useful, having an example project. The next thing I want to sort of talk about very quickly is, are you a typical customer? I think this is something, again, that's really undervalued. I think at MRDC we know what customers are best. We work best with. That's not to say that we don't want other customers and that we might be the right fit for you still, but actually being a typical customer means that they're used to working with you, they're used to train you in the right way, they're used to spending that time, or if it's a very intuitive piece of software, they're probably not. They're used to just you getting on with it. So finding out whether you're a good fit, I think, is really important. That's quite hard to do. But I think direct questioning of software suppliers is something that I don't think is something I mind myself. I'm happy to be asked what our customers are. I'm not going to talk about that here. I told you this is not a sales presentation. This is a teaching informative one. But I think asking direct questions about what you are and finding out whether that fits is really important. I put another slide up here for long-term productivity. I think something that's underestimated is that some products can be quick to get sort of reasonably productive with, but you don't hit a higher level of productivity. And I think it's one of the most underestimated things that people buying software don't tend to consider productivity. How long are the people who are using this software going to spend using it? And that can make quite a difference. So for example, if you've got somebody who's spending 10 hours a week, which is perhaps about just under a quarter or a quarter of their time, whatever it might be, if they're going to spend 10 hours a week on the software, using the software, that's 480 hours a year. Let's say they have 4 weeks holiday. Now, if they could be more productive and do whatever they were doing in 25% less time, that's 120 hours that they've saved across a year. This is just one person. It's not a team. And let's say their hourly rate, and of course, I know we're dealing with audience far and wide here where hourly rates are very varied, but let's just sake of argument, say that's $10 an hour. 120 hours is $1,200 a year. Now, you can scale those figures up. You can say they work on it or down. You can say it's 5 hours a week, 10% more productive, $20 an hour. But put that arithmetic into a spreadsheet and multiply it by the number of users, and productivity becomes arguably more important than the cost of the software itself. We know there's people who use our software where from the productivity it completely pays for the cost of the software. So productivity is really important, and the reason I've added long-term productivity here is there any cost benefit in the long term? Once staff get better and better at it, and with the software vendors' help, can you get productivity up even further than perhaps you would in the first 1 month, 3 months, depending on the product you're using, 6 months? It would vary from product to product. So is there an upward path in terms of productivity, or once they've done their first project, will they be just as productive and no more productive the longer they use it? So those things I think are really important things to put into a spreadsheet, and we will be sending out a calculator that will help you with this in the coming weeks as a follow-up to this webinar to help you cost that out. But productivity, I really think, is possibly one of the most underestimated things and one of the most important things. And I've come back to value. I mentioned price at the beginning, and value is not price. It's probably putting together a lot of the things I've talked about already, and I've encouraged you to put into a spreadsheet, productivity being one of them. I'd ask you to think about the value to the business. How important is the software you're buying to your business? If it's something that's a nice extra that perhaps makes something slightly more efficient, it might not be very important. If it's something that's fundamental to your business, it has a far greater value. So if it's something that can mean, for example, that you can provide online dashboards to your customers, that might have a huge value. But perhaps before you've either been getting customized dashboards at enormous expense or not giving dashboards to your customers, which might have lost you repeat business. Now, if you've got a piece of software that can do online dashboards easily and reasonably cheaply, perhaps that's giving huge value to your business. You might have a tool that means that your execs can do their own charts, for example, more easily. That might be saving you time, bringing efficiencies, making your researchers more effective rather than going back to data processing to get some charts done or whatever else it might be. How important is it? What's the value to your business? Staff costs by grade are obviously very important. How much training is needed and what's the return on that investment of training? And really all of this is about return on investment. What is the risk? What is the risk of you making a bad decision when you buy that software? If you buy this online piece of data collection software, is there a risk that if it's a bad choice that you had invested so much time and effort as well as license fees that changing to one that's better is quite a costly mistake? So really a focus there on value and productivity, which I mentioned before that. And I'm going to come next to perhaps really the most important thing of all, and that is, does it feel right? With all these things that I've asked you to look at and consider above perhaps the obvious two or three, does it feel right? I think is a really important one. you really should feel that you're buying from a software vendor that you think you can work with and works in a way that suits your business. That might sound very obvious, um, but I don't think sometimes software vendors or software buyers, sorry, question the vendors beforehand enough. I don't feel, even from people who buy from us, don't question us enough sometimes. They check the functionality, they check the price, but they don't perhaps check enough to see whether we're the right fit for them and work in the right way for them. And I think they should, to reassure themselves that we're right. So does it feel right? More of an emotional thing, that, but I think it's an important thing that you shouldn't let go. And finally, I would ask you to just I come back to what I said at the beginning. We cover a lot of this type of thing on our blog. We're like to be very open about the topics we discuss. If you think there's any articles that should be written, or you would like our opinions on our blog that sort of fit around this subject, I'll be very pleased to hear about them if you email me, or email one of our team. But we discuss these sorts of issues regularly on our blog with a view to helping you and teaching you and helping you think and come up with, really what I think are the practical issues involved, in terms of data, scripting, what your needs are, data compatibility, upgrade, support people, whether you're typical. All these things are very important, obviously to forget productivity and value, and that last point, does it feel right? So thank you for your attention. I'm happy to take any questions that anyone has to ask rather, and thank you for joining me on this webinar. And I'll take any questions now if there are any, Charlotte.
Oh yeah, yep. Thanks, Phil, for that. We've got a couple that have come in here, so I'll just start working through them. One of the first one we've got is trials of software only offer enough time for basic functionalities. How can you estimate productivity?
Sorry, trials of software. I missed a bit in the middle there. Can you say it
Trials of
again?
software only offer enough time for basic functionality. How can you estimate productivity?
Okay. I think it's quite a good question. Something I mentioned during the webinar was having checklists, and I think separating a typical project and perhaps your most complex projects. Of course, this will be only relevant to how your business runs and the type of software, of course. But if you can separate what your typical work is and perhaps look at one or two problem projects that you might have, or difficult projects you might have, and put those things into a checklist for us or the software vendor to answer, or give responses to. I think that's a good way then to look ahead to estimate what how productivity will fare in the future. But I mean, just asking the outright question is, asking people asking a software vendor from their experience, what sort of productivity gains can I expect when I've been using this for a year, or whatever seems relevant to you, is a good direct question that you should ask. And I would honestly say very few potential buyers that come to us actually ask that question. I think I did have one actually quite recently, as it happened, but most vendors don't come to us. Sorry, most buyers don't come to us and say, what productivity gains can I expect in the year, and what sort of form they take. Direct questioning is something I really do recommend, and I don't think there's enough of it personally. But yes, thank you for the question.
Great, thanks, Phil. We've got some software has user interface and scripting. Can the same staff use these both?
That's quite a broad question and really depends product to product. But I know what you mean. I talked about GUI software with graphical user interfaces, and I talked about scripting languages, though they were totally separate. And indeed, in many cases, they are. There are quite a few hybrid products out there where you can use the script. You use a graphical user interface or menu-driven system for most of the things, and then you can upgrade or do some things as well in a scripting language. So both are there. So it's not always an either or. It's that both are available within the same software. I think sometimes you learn shortcuts or commands that you can type in software. I'm thinking of something like SPSS. I'll name a product, for example, that many people know, where it has got a scripting language. I've not worked with that scripting language much, but I have learnt one or two commands that can save me a bit of time without bothering to learn the whole thing. So on one side, you can say, yes, people who mainly use the menu-driven system can pick up odd commands and shortcuts and things to do things that they want regularly in a scripting language. But other than that, I think there's quite a big gap between people who use menu-driven software and scripting language. I think most people can use menu-driven software because we use software day in, day out on our phones and all sorts of other places. But to learn a scripting language, you need to be a person with certain skills or types of skills. So hopefully that answers your question.
Thanks for that. What data formats do you think software should support?
Well, the answer to that is the ones you want. But if it's a sort of general question, I think as a minimum it should support SSS, which is the interchange format that I mentioned, which allows you to move data and projects from one piece of software in market research to another. So I think that's about 50 software vendors or products that are SSS compliant, as it were. SPSS, I think, is quite useful, not because it's necessarily the best software in the world by any means, but because a lot of people use it around the world. Many companies have a license to use SPSS to do whatever it is they want to do with it, whether it be multivariate work or just some basic counts and things like that. So that's another format I think that's often wanted, and being able to get data out into a spreadsheet or sometimes a CSV, a comma separated file, I think is also very useful. So they're probably the three I would go for: SSS, SPSS, and some form of Excel or comma separated. But it depends what you're doing. If you want it to be compatible with something else that you use or your clients use, you'll need to make sure that is possible as well.
Cool, thank you. I've got one more here. I like your points about pricing and value, but guessing productivity is impossible without a long-term trial.
Well, I sort of covered that a little bit in the first question. I think it's difficult. I wouldn't deny it's difficult. I think it can still be evaluated in a short-term trial. I mean, one thing you can ask is to see if you can. Some vendors are open to this, and some aren't, and sometimes it's not practical, and sometimes it is practical. But I mean, if you think you've got the right piece of software, but you really need, say, 6 months or 4 months or 3 months to put it to a real live test, many software vendors, depending on the product field it's in, might be willing to give you a 3-month paid trial, for example. I'm not sure too many want to give 6-month free trials, so you can do a long-term productivity assessment. But you might be able to talk about having a paid for 6-month trial rather than perhaps taking a whole year license, which is what most software vendors in market research offer. But I think direct questions, again, ask vendors some difficult questions and let them look at or consider your more difficult projects or projects where you think the most productivity gains might be there for having. But ask questions is probably the only other thing I can offer there. But yes, it is difficult. But I think it's a question. If I was asked, I would be pleased to hear and be very willing to answer with any of our products. So I don't see why other software vendors shouldn't be.
All right, well, great. Well, that's all the questions we've got in today. Thanks, Phil.
Good.
So I think that will close the webinar today. I've recorded this webinar, so what I'll do is probably tomorrow send out the recording to everyone that's attended today. And thanks for coming.
All right, thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Goodbye. Goodbye.